Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Great,
It's Jane.
thank you. Thank you, Jane.
I'm
Yes,
trying to
Peter?
allow something, but it's not letting me do it, but it's okay. Is everything okay? All I can do, I can just sit here and you can't see this thing saying allow hop in to see your screen.
No, everything is fine. I can just see you just sitting there, so and it can hear you fine as well.
Okay, I'm very grateful, Nina.
So I can see people are coming in right now.
And Awino, I'm very excited to see that you're here as well. I spent 14 years at SOAS. You're on mute. I developed the first master's course in the human rights of women, which received a lot of opposition.
Why?
It wasn't regarded at that time. It was 96. It wasn't regarded as an area where you could study. I mean, they thought that I would say women are oppressed every seminar rather than other things.
Okay, so I think people are joining now. There's a lot of people have joined, so I think we'll get going. So everybody, first of all, to introduce myself, I'm Nina Musgrave. I am Assistant Director at the Centre for Defence Studies in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. So it's a great pleasure to meet all the panelists. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you to all the attendees. And please keep the questions coming as you did earlier. So there's a lot of very good questions in the chat function. So please keep those coming. Just a few housekeeping announcements. Just a reminder that this is being recorded. So I'll get going on the session. So without too much detail, to give enough time to the panelists, this session is about institutional barriers to change. So from 2003, the United Nations has been introducing new measures to tackle and respond to sexual exploitation and abuse. And in 2017, the UN formally acknowledged that the problem of this was greater amongst its civilian staff than its military peacekeepers, and that this was a problem that affected all institutions of the United Nations. So this session will explore the institutional barriers to achieving serious change on tackling these problems in the aid industry, including barriers at the United Nations and within NGOs. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. So we have Peter Gallo, followed by Jane Connors, followed by Dr. Awino Okage. So I will start by introducing Peter, and I'll give a brief bio. Then Peter will speak for 10 minutes. And speakers, you've been asked to keep it to 10 minutes if possible. And then I'll introduce the next speaker, sort of 3 speakers in a row, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the 3 sessions. So to introduce Peter, so Peter Gallo quite unusually joined the United Nations from the private sector. So he was a lawyer who specialized in anti-money laundering. And in 2011, he was recruited by the United Nations as an investigator in the Office of Internal Oversight Services and the Investigations Division in New York. And this put him on what the UN describes as the epicenter of their efforts to combat fraud, misconduct, and abuse, and specifically sexual abuse. Unfortunately, after his insights there and his personal experiences with the UN justice system, he came to realize that OIOS, where he was working, was a large part of the problem, not part of the solution, and he left to become an outspoken critic of the United Nations, particularly about the manner in which corruption is covered up. On one occasion, while still working there, he made a joke about becoming the most hated man in the history of the United Nations. So shortly after he left in 2015, news of the child sex abuse scandal in the Central African Republic broke, and a journalist contacted him, which led to Peter suddenly doing a lot of media engagement and continuing to be very, very outspoken. He has also testified twice before Congress. So as Peter says, we don't know if his joke about becoming the most hated man in the United Nations history has quite come true, but he feels like he's potentially on the shortlist. Along with Andrew MacLeod and Ed Flaherty, Peter is also one of the 3 founders of Hear Their Cries. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now all I need to do is share my screen with you. Nope, I'm not. Okay, we have a minor technical problem, and I'm not. It's not. Okay, where's the share screen button?
You'll see it looks like a television with a cross through it, the red cross through it.
Oh, no, we're right. Okay, let me. Can you see me?
Let's give it a couple of seconds.
Tell me what you're seeing.
You,
I
as before.
don't want you to see me. People have seen me before.
Okay, have you clicked on the upload button?
Okay. Let me try and see. Nope, nothing's happening.
Okay, so would you like me to upload it, or would you like to just do your? I think you could just do your presentation without the slides.
Okay. Well, I need them because that's the only thing I have to talk about. Okay, I'm sorry you've got the radio version, but as I say, I've been asked to speak about international barriers to change. In the short time available, I'm going to have to take a few things as given, what I describe as self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, and what the UN says is not always the same as what the UN does. Unfortunately, you can't see my my diagram of this, but as an aside, I have this mildly irreverent and amusing diagram of the UN's traditional response to allegations of corruption and other vices, whether it's sexual fraud or anything else in the organization. And the logic basically says that there is no corruption in the organization. And we know this because nobody ever reports any. And this is because there is no misconduct in the organization. And therefore, it proves the fact that we were right to start with. And in the very unlikely occasion that there is misconduct reported, the investigations never find any, and that's because there is no corruption in the organization. Now, it's mildly amusing. You're free to laugh if you see the diagram, but it relies on two things, one of which is the reporting of misconduct, and the other is the investigation of misconduct. And if you hang on to that thought, we'll be back to it. What I want to also consider, and the reason I mention that, and I'm sorry you can't see it, is because there are two questions that that hang off it, and one of which is how the UN treats staff who are retaliated against for reporting misconduct, and the other is how the UN reacts to either inept investigation work or unethical behavior by investigators. I'm going to address the issue of information which is in the public domain, the deterrence of crime, which Andrew has already touched upon, and the corporate culture in the organization. Now, in the public domain, should anyone be interested in looking at it, you will find there's evidence of a widespread reluctance to recognize the extent of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN field mission environments. You will find a widespread lack of whistleblower protection in the UN for staff who do report it. If you don't believe me, you can look at all the information on whistleblowers that there is, particularly Martina Brostrom, who reported what was not actually sexual harassment, but was a sexual assault by UNAIDS, in UNAIDS. And I'll come back to that one. What concerns me most, and what concerned me originally, were numerous examples of what was either gross ineptitude or a spectacular lack of by investigators in the UN. That is in itself fairly serious. If you don't believe me, I'm going to refer you back to the on the question of ineptitude. Anyone interested in this subject has to look at the what is known about the investigations in DECOA in 2016. Right, there are many others. You can look at the Ahuja case, you look at Mobanga, and any number of others that I can point you in the direction of. On the question of a lack of integrity, you have to go back to the Nguyen Krop and Postica judgment in the tribunal and the organization's response to that. And whilst we're on the subject, if you want a more up-to-date one, there's the question of the hands in the pants case, which the Secretary General has been very adept at cunningly not answering or not going anywhere near. And the general widespread lack of accountability in the organization, especially for investigators who mismanage these investigations. Now, Andrew has mentioned already that the issue of deterrence, right? But encouraging victims to report assaults in the organization is pointless without three things. One of which is genuine protection for the victims, which the UN is not in a position to deliver. Competent and diligent investigations, which the UN should be able to deliver, but patently does not. And the third one is the political will to ensure that criminal actions are prosecuted, which the UN is not in a position to deliver. But raising awareness has no effect on deterring criminal conduct. People who are doing something illegal know that it's illegal. They don't need to be told. And again, as Andrew pointed out, the deterrence is not the severity of the penalty. The deterrence depends on increasing the chances that the perpetrator will be caught and held accountable for it. That is a basic fact of criminology, which I regret that the UN has been spectacularly unable and unwilling to recognize. But the importance of this is that we are dealing with something illegal. This is not just antisocial behavior or social policy or a cultural or social phenomenon, although there are aspects of that to it. It is conduct which is fundamentally illegal. And the UN has been spectacularly failing to address years, right? Proving, if nothing else, that self-regulation does not work. But when we're dealing with something illegal, the question has to be, who can we most rely on to actually report it, right? Is it the victims? Well, possibly, and in some cases they do, right? But the question is, can you actually rely on victims to come forward? It is hard enough to get rape victims to come forward and report offences in London. What chances do you seriously think you've got in places like the Congo or Haiti? Right? Refugees or other locals are going to report an activity for which they are not the victim. We have credible press reports of refugees being required to pay bribes for resettlement in other organizations, in other countries. Sorry, you seriously think people in those positions are going to put their neck out to report something of which they're not a victim, their own position against the organization who they are relying on for their own food and their own protection? And the third one, of course, is, well, staff of the UN and other aid organizations. What excuse do they have? Right. That takes me on, unfortunately, to talk about the UN corporate culture, experience of which reveals that the organization considers its primary responsibility is to protect its own reputation. If you're a Star Trek fan, I consider this, we call this the prime directive. You must always protect the reputation of the organization. And the example of this is that in 2015, when the child sex abuse scandal in DCOA broke, right, 6 cabinet level officials of the UN sat around. Their primary concern was punishing the one official who had actually tried to stop this abuse, which actually had nothing to do with the UN. The abuse was not by UN personnel, and it was something over which the UN had no jurisdiction. But the concern was that it might independently rub off on the UN, and none of them actually had either the brains or the fundamental awareness of risk management to understand that systematic child abuse was something that the international community might expect them to do something about. Now, the culture of the organization is fostered by 3 things, one of which is a primary focus on procedures. Right? The second is a general lack of accountability. And the third I want to talk about is the Convention on Privileges and Immunities. Let me start first with the privileges and immunities. It's very simple. Anyone with a reading age of about 12 can go and read section 18, right? And that's what it says. Officials of the UN are immune from legal process, words spoken, written, acts performed in their official capacity. And that is the operative words in this section. Now, the reality is that if you are an official of the UN, let me put it to you, that having sex with anyone else, be it conjugal, consensual, contractual, or commercial, right, is not something done in the course of your official capacity. It is not part of anybody's job description. If it was, there would be people applying for it, right? So why is the immunity being used and misused for this purpose? The immunity is described in section 20 as for the benefit of the United Nations and not for the personal benefit of the organization itself. The organization has an obligation, the Secretary General, sorry, has a duty to waive that immunity. And what is the current practice is, although the organization will claim that they waive the immunity, and they always waive the immunity, they do so at the end of an administrative investigation. The only problem with that is that there is very little point in going to the authorities in Congo or the Central African Republic and saying, we have this case of a rape which took place 3 years ago by an individual who used to be a staff member who is no longer working for the UN, and we don't know where he is. And by the way, we don't know where the victim is either. But I believe Ed has spoken about that. It is something that has to be addressed. Nobody is suggesting that the UN have no immunity. It is just a factor in how it affects the culture of the organization. The second point I wanted to talk about was the focus on procedure. In as much as this affects the situation with child sex abuse in missions, the problem is that the organization, the problem is that the organization considers that an investigation is simply a procedure to be followed. A procedure as in a procedure that you can teach a monkey to follow, right? Yes, there are procedures to be followed, but that is not a substitute for actually using your head and thinking thinking about it. My claim to fame in the UN is that I was officially told in writing that as an investigator, I must never ask questions just to satisfy my curiosity. That was about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm still being bought drinks by other investigators to tell the story. But the problem is that there are senior officials in OIOS who actually believe and who tell their staff that all they have to do is go through the procedure because the member states don't care about the outcome. All the member states care about is having something done, right? I tend to disagree with that, but that is the prevailing management position, and no one will contradict it. From the point of view of the staff member, on this question of procedure, the problem with the justice system in the UN, which is ostensibly there for the protection of staff members, is that the justice only addresses failures to follow the procedure. It is unlike any other administrative law tribunal anywhere else in the world because it's not actually concerned with such concepts as Wednesbury unreasonableness. Again, it is just a procedure. What people have to understand that if the UN is riddled with vice and corruption from bottom to top, it doesn't matter because the corruption is procedurally correct. And that brings me on to the lack of accountability. The UN considers itself a little world unto itself, and in many ways it actually is. But this lack of accountability is built in at multiple levels. Trying to illustrate this by a sort of solar system, but it doesn't matter because you can't see my diagram. But the point is that whistleblower protection in the UN simply doesn't work, right? If you look at cases, look at what happened to Martina Brostrom, who reported, as I say, a sexual assault in UNAIDS. Oddly enough, the organization finds that she's never been retaliated against, and she was investigated and dismissed for something entirely different. If you believe that, you will believe that fairies live at the bottom of my garden. You look at the case study of Emma Riley, who has been fighting for basically recognition for about 7 years. The last year for which stats are available, which I think was about 2012, the Ethics Office found a prima facie case of retaliation in less than 4% of applications, right? It simply doesn't work. The system doesn't work because the UN doesn't want it to work, all right? The judgment in the Wasserstrom decision in the UNAT in June 2014 actually confirmed that protection was not a right, it was discretionary. That actually...
1 minute, Peter, if that's okay. A minute or two.
Sorry?
Just 1 or 2 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you.
1 or 2 minutes of sorry. I don't understand you.
So 1 or 2 minutes, if you could finish in a minute or two.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
Whistle protection doesn't work. Investigations is another one which is serious. And again, the problem is investigations that are very poor quality and process driven, all right? Anyone doesn't believe me, you've got to go and look at the DCOA allegations and the reports which we know that are in public now. The one I'm working on at the moment is, again, in the public domain, the investigation into the head of UNICEF in Papua New Guinea has just come out as a UNDT decision, right? Compare that with others. Someone dismissed for sexual harassment on the basis of an investigation which doesn't actually show any sexual harassment at all, but don't worry about it. The problem is there is no oversight over the investigation function. And the UN couldn't design a better system to sabotage investigations if they tried. The conduct and discipline function screens complaints with a view to making as few of them as possible are investigated. The organization makes great play of the database of all the allegations. If you believe that that is all the allegations that they have, you've got to consider one point. How come every complaint on that database has identified the perpetrator? If the victim cannot produce the name and address of the assailant, the UN manages to lose the complaint. The next one is how cases are referred. If you want an example of that, you look at the case of Tammy Fisher, who reported statutory rape by 3 police officers. And what did the UN do? They referred the investigation to their own department, who absolutely found nothing about it. The justice system, I have statistics for which you can't see, which is unfortunate, but basically the statistics show that there's a 25% chance, for the first 10 years of the administration of the new justice system, there's a 25% chance of a judgment being handed down in favor of the staff member. But what I'd like to be able to show you, and I do apologize for this, is that the statistics taken straight from the Administration of Justice annual report for 2017 show something curious. If a case goes to the dispute tribunal and the staff member loses and appeals, they have a 5% chance of reversing that decision on appeal. If the judgment is handed down in favor of the staff member and the administration loses, so they appeal, they have a 93% chance of having the decision overturned on appeal. And that, in summary, explains why, what is the prospects for a staff member who reports misconduct? The answer, I'm sorry, is very, very little, none. So much so that you may accuse me of being part of the problem, because I am no longer willing to legally represent any other staff member in front of the tribunals, because I know that I'm only giving them false hope and giving them delaying the inevitable. In the 75 years of the UN, there has never been a case of a staff member who was dismissed, who appealed that decision successfully and was then reinstated. Right. So what is the protection for the staff member who does report anything amiss, and what are the consequences for investigations which are quite frankly so inept that it doesn't bear thinking about? Self-regulation simply doesn't work. Andrew has already addressed the need for an independent agency to investigate paternity and other examples of external wrongdoing. The reason that I believe the Convention on Privileges and Immunities is so important is because even today, sexual exploitation and abuse cases can and should be referred to the national authorities at the point at which the UN establishes reasonable grounds to believe that a crime has been committed, right? Because immunity should not and cannot be used to cover this up. I've just heard a bell ting, so I'm either that's an incoming text message for me, or I'm going to stop there because I can't show you any more of my disruptions. But I'm sorry about that, and I'm going to be available to answer any intelligent questions that are thrown at me to the best of my ability. Nina?
Thank you very very much, Peter. Thank you very much. Sorry about the slides, but hopefully we'll be able to disseminate them or figure something out. So thank you, and hopefully we'll get some good questions for you in the Q&A as well. So thank you very much. We'll move on swiftly to our next speaker, Dr. Erwina Okage. I don't know if she's turned her video on. She's. Sorry, I've just done something weird at my computer. Apologies. Sorry about that. So I'll introduce Dr. Okage. So Awino is a reader in gender studies at SOAS, which is part of the University of London. Her teaching and research interests lie in the nexus between gender, sexuality, and nation-state making projects as they occur in conflict and post-conflict societies. She also has a much longer history of gender and conflict programming work in Africa with a range of international and national organizations. So you're very welcome. So you can take it from here.
Thank you very, very much, Nina, and for the organizers of the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. I want to begin by foregrounding, of course, that a lot of what I'm going to say are arguments that have been made by feminist scholars and activists for a very long time around the questions of structural violence and the ways in which gender violence in particular manifests across the society. And so a discussion about sexual exploitation and abuse, whether it occurs within broad institutions such as the United Nations or international organizations, is really an indication of what the structure of our society already facilitates and allows in relation to questions of gender violence. Jane, your screen is showing and your inbox is being viewed. Thank you very much, Jane. So let me make 6 to 5 quick points. And the first point that I want to make that really also connects to some of the arguments that previous panelists were raising in relation to dealing directly with children who are born out of these abusive relations is around the geopolitics of structural violence. And I think there's something particular that sexual exploitation and abuse reveals around the architecture of poverty that allows for particular women to be vulnerable to the kind of abuse that is targeted against them, whether it's by civilians, non-civilians, within the context of conflict, post-conflict or violence, or generalized situations of impoverishment. And so it's critical for us to think about resolving or the failures and difficulties around dealing with sexual exploitation and abuse and the institutional hurdles by using the framework of the geopolitics of violence. Because when you have UN officials or INGOs working in particular countries, there's a context that has brought them to those countries, whether it's a humanitarian crisis, whether it's a conflict crisis, and we cannot examine those situations of conflicts outside of the geopolitical environment that puts particular states in conversation with broader frameworks of militarization and securitization. And so even in a situation where you're thinking about support for children who are seeking to find their fathers, who are seeking to find some remedies of some kind as a result of how they have arrived in this world, one of the things that we must be wary of not creating a situation in which we are positioning people finding their fathers or seeking heritage or seeking a claim to a heritage in the global north as part of a dialogue about seeking a better life. I think there are ways in which we must be careful that that is not what we are reproducing when we're talking about the importance of them finding their fathers as a claim to citizenship or a claim to particular kinds of economic support from parents who are argued to come from a wealthier part of the world. The second point that I want to make is a long-standing argument that many of us have made, which is around the problems that arise with treating exploitation, treating harassment, treating abuse as a criminal act, or treating it as something that emerges out of a specific condition. So for instance, when we talk about war or rape as a weapon of war, part of the contentions that feminist activists and scholars have had around that terminology, however useful it has been for enabling policies such as 1325 and the range of other UN resolutions that have arisen from that, is that it suggests that the rape that we see during situations of armed conflict is germane to the conflict environment, and not that it forms part of a continuum of violence that is only escalated by a situation of conflict. So that is one dynamic. The second dynamic of examining questions of violence as criminal acts is also around the fact that you're dealing with violence as an act committed by a set of individuals who are acting out of character. So you jettison it to the area of criminality rather than recognizing that in our societies, there are various degrees of violence that have been permitted, and they target women, they target girls, they target gender non-conforming people to a particular degree across all of our societies, whether we're talking about the global north or the majority world. And the central point that I want to draw the listener's attention to here in relation to this argument is the fact that what we need to be paying attention to is the architecture of violence and the way in which it is directly connected to gender as an organizing principle in our societies, and violence as a disciplinary tool that is used to manage relationships of power and powerlessness. So sexual exploitation and abuse, the rape that happens in situations of conflict, the daily violence that we see in most of our societies is born from this infrastructure that connects patriarchy and other kinds of male privilege and violence as an organizing principle across most of our societies. Therefore, to address the question around the lack of institutional commitment is to go back to ask the questions about how we organize our societies in the first place and how it is that we enable a sense of belonging for all members of our societies without the use of violence or the threat of violence as a way to manage our social and political relations. The third point that I want to draw attention to in relation to the difficulties of gaining institutional traction is often around the point that is linked to the policies, the political will, as many of us will call it, or the policies and laws that are put in place as part of regulating behavior. I think many of us know that the work that we have been invested in is work about behavioral change. What you're trying to do is shift the ways in which people think about our relations with others in society. But we retreat to the area of law and policies because we recognize that behavioral change work is long-term work, and that policies and laws are a way to sort of regulate behavior as you work on the conscientization and change and transformation work that is part of our transformation agenda. But part of the challenge of gender equality policies generally and laws and policies that are associated with violence against women has been the question of negotiation around them. So rather than accept that violence against women and girls is an endemic problem in our societies, that this is a non-negotiable question, that this is something that institutions are taking a zero tolerance approach to, it's seen as a negotiated question. So even with 1325 and its adoption within the United Nations, as well as the other resolutions that are linked to 1325, these were robust policy documents that when they arrived at the UN and at the point of being accepted as resolutions had been watered down. They had been stripped of their radical element. They had been stripped of their transformative element as a result of these political negotiations and political elite, state and non-state actors, trying to figure ways out to manage the social-cultural power dynamics and the cultural institutions from which their own power is vested. Instead, what we end up with, therefore, are laws and policies that are designed to protect political elite and not necessarily to protect those who are victims of our social environments and the political environments that create hostile situations and create violence for them. The fourth point that I want to recognize and underline here is really the broader global environment in which we are seeing an increasing regression in connection to freedoms, rights and freedoms that many of us took for granted, rights and freedoms that our mothers and grandmothers assumed that were no longer part of a negotiated settlement, if you will, for women and girls in our societies. And we are seeing this regression in the conversations around gender ideology. We are seeing these regressions in the conversations around trans right or queer-related rights. Now, part of the tension, I think, has always been the assertion by people who think that to talk about trans rights is to take away the rights of women, is to ignore the fact that whenever any conversations are happening in our societies around homosexuality, around trans rights, in effect, those conversations happen at the same time as lines are being redrawn around what respectable femininities look like, around what respectable homosexuality or heterosexuality looks like. So to challenge or to speak about the irrelevance, if you will, of trans rights or the irrelevance of queer rights is actually to re-emphasize the fact that women should perform very conservative and restricted roles in our society, and in essence, open up the door for the forms of violence and exploitation that we end up seeing during humanitarian crisis and other kinds of conflict situations. So it's very important for folks who are doing work around sexual and exploitation and abuse to watch the convergence of actors, the church, various kinds of religious organizations, various kinds of extremist far-right political parties that are gaining ground across Europe and North America. You know, nationalist sentiments that gain ground across most of our political terrain are part of the institutional hardwiring or challenge that is being posed to questions of gender equality, but much more specifically, that these discourses are reliant on violence and gender violence and violence against women in particular as a mechanism of how they mobilize what white nationalism means, what Britishness looks like, or what Americanness looks like. So to pay attention to debates around homosexuality, queer rights, trans rights, is also to pay attention to why there's a difficulty in seeking redress for women and girls who are affected by sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian and non-humanitarian contexts. The final point that I want to draw attention to, which is linked to the question of political will, is around resources. Many feminist movements and organizations, feminist funds in particular in the last 5 years, have provided a lot of empirical evidence around resourcing for women's rights, resourcing for feminist movement building work. And we know, I know as somebody who has lived in the African continent for the better part of my life and invested a great deal of work on working around questions of gender-based violence, is that the policies and laws do not implement themselves without resources put in them to ensure that the infrastructure to operationalize those policies are actually in place. So if the political will is not backed up by the financial resources, there is hardly ever going to be any movement in relation to addressing some of these structural problems. The reality is that a vast amount of the work around violence against women or gender-based violence or sexual exploitation and abuse comes from bilateral funding or comes from resources of private philanthropy. And very rarely is this work budgeted for directly in the same way that you would find education, health, and infrastructure being a priority area of recurrent budgeting by governments within the budgeting infrastructure of various countries. So resources, financial resources, that therefore it will be accompanied by human resources and then is encapsulated by this idea of political will, is the final point that I would argue hinders an institutional commitment to address these questions. Thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you very much. It was really, really fascinating. So hopefully we'll get some good questions at the end. Thank you, Awino. So finally, we have Jane Connors. Jane is a United Nations Victims' Rights Advocate on sexual exploitation and abuse. Previously, she served as the Director of International Advocacy for Amnesty International. She has held various positions at the United Nations, including at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and academic posts in the United Kingdom and Australia, including 14 years at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is where Dr. Okage teaches. So thank you, Jane. So I'll let you speak now.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'm
Yes.
still practicing with this new system. Thank you very much, Nina. And welcome, best wishes to all panelists on my panel and the panels before. I did get up, so I watched this from 4 a.m. in the morning, and all the participants. I'm grateful to King's College London for inviting me to participate. In 2017, and much in reaction to the scandals that Peter drew attention to regarding the Central African Republic, our Secretary General launched a new approach on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. The principal element of this is to place the rights and dignity of victims of these wrongs at the centre of prevention and response efforts. Now, this is a real shift from earlier approaches. It requires us to focus on the victims and the multifaceted and lasting impact of sexual exploitation on them, their families and communities, rather than on the reputation of our complex family of organisations with 35 family members and the conduct and discipline of our personnel. The victim's rights advocate, and the role was created by the Secretary General himself, is required to operationalise this approach by acting as a global advocate for victims, seeking to entrench a rights-based approach to prevention and response across the entire UN system. In the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and South Sudan, field victims advocates reflect this role very practically. They are the main contact for victims. They accompany them as they seek assistance and accountability, and keep them abreast of their cases. Our roles are system-wide, and therefore we interact with victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by United Nations international and national personnel, uniformed and civilian personnel in peacekeeping, and civilian personnel in humanitarian development settings. And here, you know, as earlier speakers have noted, power imbalance between these personnel and the people we serve, those people's situation of extreme vulnerability, and the broader context of inequality and discrimination drives these wrongs. In September, myself, the field and the victims' rights advocate and the field victims' rights advocates will have been in function for 4 years. As the first advocate, I was required to carve out the role and chose to prioritise giving visibility to victims, emphasising that at the core of these wrongs is a person who is hurt, fearful, often subject to reprisals, stigma, and perhaps exclusion from their families and communities, and maybe left with a child. Until the pandemic grounded me, I met victims in countries where the UN operates on their own terms to hear from them directly. Their concerns, of course, vary depending on the country and context, but more or less are these. Complaint pathways are inaccessible, unclear, or complex. They lack protection or have limited medical, psychological, and livelihood support. They experience distressing investigative procedures, often with repeated interviews. They have little or no support for legal or other redress, particularly on paternity child support claims, and very patchy information on the progress of their complaints, such as whether the abuser has been held accountable in some way. The field victims' rights advocates receive similar but more detailed feedback. For example, they hear that necessary documentation or laboratory results are not available. Victims cannot open bank accounts to receive remittances from the fathers of their children because they lack the minimum deposit required. Victims require medical care for themselves and or their children, and they have limited access to skills training and livelihood support activities. And the advocates work with others on the ground to resolve these issues. We have, in this few years since we've been in place, seen some progress in the institutionalization of a victim-centered and rights-based approach across our organizations, though there's often a little bit of allergy to talking about rights. There's a lot of desire to speak of assistance. On policy, this includes the adoption and implementation of a victims assistance protocol that's aimed at a joined-up approach for the delivery of assistance across our system. And there is also a protocol on our responsibilities for prevention and response in our collaboration with implementing partners. Tools, making allegations relating to missions, agencies, funds and programs, and our implementing partners publicly, transparently, and promptly available on the UN's website, and precluding perpetrators with substantiated allegations or who leave when an investigation is in progress and move to another part of the system are now in place. Practical support for victims has been stepped up, in particular through the multifaceted projects which are funded by a trust fund in support of victims' sexual exploitation and abuse. These projects facilitate legal, livelihood, socio-economic reintegration and other support for victims and their children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Haiti. With my support, field victims' rights advocates have mobilized pro bono lawyers in countries of jurisdiction to support resolution of paternity child support claims and work with national human rights institutions across countries to push forward legal redress. But we've got a lot to do, and we need to improve in many areas, but I'll just touch on reporting, assistance, and accountability. We now find with reporting, and there's been a lot of discussion of reporting today, there are multiple reporting pathways available through community-based complaint networks, conventional reporting methods, and electronic platforms, but there's broad unreporting. It takes courage and strength to come forward. People may not know how to report, fear they may not be believed, be humiliated, face reprisals, or believe there's no point. Pathways may be culturally or linguistically inappropriate, while high turnover of relevant personnel, poor capacity, weak confidentiality safeguards, and response compromise these channels. We are still not as conscious as we should be to the drivers of sexual exploitation and abuse, and this puts the burden for generating action on victims where we should be creating an enabling environment for reporting. Assistance. Last June, my office completed a mapping of assistance and support available to victims in 13 countries with different UN footprints. We found that services, medical, psychological, shelter, protection, and legal are usually provided through existing gender-based violence and child protection pathways delivered by implementing partners. Availability, accessibility, quality, capacity, timeliness, and resourcing of these vary. In remote areas and those marked by conflict or health emergencies, services may not exist, and that is where the greatest risk lies. Often service providers do not take the specific requirements of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse into account. Legal support and assistance is largely unavailable, including on paternity child support claims, which are complex in the best of systems, but are very difficult if transnational. Victims don't know how to access services, often as a result of lack of coordination among our entities. Also, while there's a legal framework for victims' assistance and support established by the General Assembly, this is very narrow, and more importantly, there's no funding to support it. There's a victims' assistance tracking system now operative in peace operations and special political missions, but there's no system-wide tool to track victims, the support they receive, and available service providers, so they may slip through the cracks. Notably, during this pandemic, they've moved across countries and borders, and I have to say the field victims' rights advocates have been very innovative in maintaining contact. There's been a lot of discussion of accountability today. Realize justice, accountability, and remedies is a huge challenge. Some may not wish to be part of administrative, disciplinary, or legal accountability proceedings. But if they do, they're often surprised that the UN's capacity to sanction is that of an employer and limited to administrative sanctions against perpetrators where the case is substantiated. Routes to legal accountability depend on the category of the offending personnel. And while the UN has a responsibility to cooperate, usually this requires significant action from states. Legal avenues to satisfy paternity claims involve multiple jurisdictions, sometimes with very unfriendly laws. This is dispiriting and disempowering for victims, and we look for solutions that aim to create an agreement between the parents so that the paternity can be established and further claims can be made. These are overarching challenges, but there are others. We know that victims report to those they trust and believe that will lead them to assistance. And we've seen that when there is a field of victims' rights advocate to champion their individual rights, including to assistance, accompany them through investigative and legal processes, and engage in sustained outreach to communities, things work better. We need these staff everywhere the UN operates, and so do aid organisations. Victims also don't spend time determining the affiliation of a perpetrator, so don't differentiate among UN entities, non-governmental actors and others when they complain. We need a joined-up approach and a way to exchange information directed towards a common purpose, so we have action. We all need to hear what our beneficiaries need, as well as the opinions of victims of how we are doing, so our policies and actions are relevant. And finally, states, they must step up in accountability processes and resolution of paternity claims. For example, some are organising courts-martial for their personnel in countries where abuses have occurred, and some are strengthening their procedures on paternity. And we push others, drawing attention to these examples. And we even have to push those with the requisite legislative and judicial tools, such as extraterritorial jurisdiction, to work harder. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A question in the comments, if I may. Just how difficult do you find, to convince people of this, that victims don't necessarily want to go down the route of legal accountability? Because I would imagine a lot of people would just operate on the assumption that they do.
You know, I am a lawyer, so I will preface it by that, and I do significantly believe in the rule of law and the power of law and so on. But as I say, I meet victim survivors on their own terms, and they don't talk to me about the law. They talk to me about, if they have children, they might. If they have children born of sexual exploitation or abuse, they will talk to me about whether there's a way that the paternity, and often they wish the paternity of the child herself or himself may wish the paternity to be clarified for their own purposes. I wish to know my father, I wish to know what my genetics is. They're pretty alive to the fact that they won't get much money. But what is really important for them is the of their lives in dignity, integration into communities through being provided or having the tools to sustain themselves. So you know, it's interesting. Law is an interesting thing. So and I'm always quoted. You know, she doesn't believe in accountability and criminal justice and things of that nature. Just this is my experience.
You've just been quite realistic about how victims prioritize, you know,
and they might lose, of course. I mean, look, I mean, what's going to happen? You've got a burden of proof and all of this sort of, you know, it's the law has been set up in a particular way.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. So we have a few questions in the Q&A which I'll read out. So the first one from Anonymous, agree Awino about the patriarchy. What would you recommend as first steps to address this to promote systemic and lasting change?
The answer is very simple, and this is the answer that women's rights organizations and feminist movements have been saying for years: zero tolerance. In the same way you have zero tolerance on corruption, and you will deal with corruption where you see it, where you find it. Zero tolerance on violence against women and sexual exploitation. You ensure that people are held accountable, legal procedures and systems and policies are implemented and operationalized. People find health services, policing services as friendly places that they can seek help and not places that re-victimize them. The answers are not complicated. It is the inability to implement them because people benefit from not implementing them, because people see them as taking away their power is what's the problem here. And I repeat again, a zero tolerance policy on violence against women and sexual exploitation.
Okay, thank you, Awino. So another question, I don't know if you can see the Q&A function. It's a fascinating, Awino. If I understand correctly, sexual exploitation and abuse is already embedded in some cultures and continues and increases when conflict, sorry, I just lost it, and continues and increases when conflict and civilian aid workers arrive in an area.
Yes, and to clarify, violence is embedded and sexual exploitation is embedded across all cultures. So I was just looking at recent statistics from the UK, where I'm currently located. And some of the numbers, for instance, talk about the fact that 40% of women are killed as a result of gendered violence. The UK police receive a call every minute about domestic abuse, and 89% of these calls are about a woman being abused by a man. So I think the point that I'm making is that patriarchal violence is not unique to specific contexts. In fact, if you think about the thing that connects feminist movements transnationally, is that we all experience the impacts of patriarchy. It just looks different in different contexts. Our racialized and class experiences will mitigate how it is that we experience patriarchy, but it is a shared experience. Now, of course, in certain contexts, because of the structural questions of poverty and global inequalities, and that humanitarian crisis might exacerbate these inequalities, then the vulnerability to sexual exploitation and abuse increases, because the infrastructures that would be available to support them are non-existent. There's no police to call. There's no health center to go to, because these have been decimated. The exploited do not have the social and economic support systems to cushion them, if you will, that they might have if you are in a welfare state, for instance. So really, to reiterate again that the experiences of violence by women and girls are shared across the globe, and that they're not unique to certain cultures and contexts. But the questions of global inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, and humanitarian and conflict crisis in specific contexts exacerbate the vulnerability that others might not necessarily have because of the national infrastructure and architecture.
Thank you very much. There's a question at the top which I think could be addressed to all of you, so you can all feel free to speak to this. How do you feel about the new language being mooted by some about changing zero tolerance to zero tolerance for inaction? So I think you can all answer that one. So maybe I should ask you all to speak to that question. Peter. Is Peter here? No. Maybe Jane.
Maybe Awino, because there is another one specific to take up anyone's time.
That's okay, because we can run over by a few minutes. So if you would like to maybe
okay,
take that one and then the one that's for you.
These are the sorts of things, I just look across my office wall and there is a big poster saying zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse. What I'd like to see is zero cases. So we have zero tolerance, and we've had zero tolerance in the UN for many, many years. Zero tolerance for inaction, certainly. But we have to somehow move from those slogans to getting to the zero cases, we should be able to. The behaviour should be able to change, pressing, and explicable to a certain extent, but very depressing when you have personnel who are working for an organisation which is supposedly based on principle.
Okay, thank you. We know to speak to that one before Jane does the other question.
Yes, I think for me, I focus less on words. For me, when I talk about zero tolerance, what I mean is that I want a world in which women and girls and gender non-conforming people are free of violence. That's all I want to see. And that's where we all want to get to, where violence is not tolerated, where people do not experience violence, where people are free from the fear of violence. And when they experience that violence, they can trust the institutions they go to deal with that violence. Because let's not lie to each other that we will end up in a certain utopia in 2 years' time, where violence is not physical violence, emotional and mental violence is not a thing that we all continue to confront. We want to aspire to an environment in which that is something we don't confront. But in an environment in which that still exists, I want to know that if I walk into an institution that is set up to ensure that it deals with that violence, they deal with it. And for me, that's what zero tolerance means. That that action that action follows. And therefore, people trust the institutions, they report the cases, so that we are not dealing with a situation where there's underreporting because people don't trust the institutions, and that the cases are dealt with effectively.
Thank you. And so very quickly, James, I do want to get to your question, but there's just one more we know. So Irene says, zero tolerance policies exist. Why is it that they are not working? What can we do better? Is it in breaking them down more or contextualizing them?
I think policies don't work because you don't have the commitment of people to make them work. I think one of the things that we need to understand in relation to questions of gender equality and violence is that underpinning it is that you're challenging power, right? Mm-hmm. It's a big challenge of power. You're challenging the way in which our societies are organized. You're asking people to redistribute power. You're asking people to think differently about people's humanity. And that's a complex challenge. And that's why we continue to have these conversations, whether it's about child's education and whether now boys are being left behind, or the questions about violence against men and whether there's been too much focus on women's violence. We are battling with institutions of power. We are battling with structures of power. And people and institutions that hold power do not cede power. And this is where the problem is. And so we all know in all of the countries that we sit in and work in, that the very people we are tasking to implement these policies are also the people who do these forms of violence within their own offices, within their own family environments, and within their own societies. So to implement these policies automatically puts them in the eye of the storm. So it is in their interest to protect themselves and to protect their cronies. And that's the biggest problem, is that you do not have the commitment of people who want to ensure that these policies work because they benefit from these policies not working. In the same way you can think about the failure to deal with corruption. People don't want to deal with corruption because they're benefiting. To deal with corruption means you're taking money away from their hands. So they're going to find ways to ensure that the systems continue to work for them. So really, it's just, again, to underscore that part of our challenges in creating this sort of systemic and structural change is because we are challenging power. And no one with power yields that power easily. And those who are sitting in positions of power benefit from inaction, benefit from the lack of operationalization. And so they're not going to yield to processes that take that power away from them easily. But to underscore again that part of the processes that many feminist movements, and I keep on emphasizing movements, because all of the policies that we see are as a result of action from feminist activists mobilizing and influencing policies, that we need to find champions within governments, within institutions that are committed to doing this work. We need to strengthen feminist movements who are the people who are on the streets, in policy spaces, in UN and African Union spaces, calling for accountability. We need to ensure that we have resources that are targeted at the police, within health services, mental health support, to ensure support for survivors of violence and those who are actually doing the work. So it's a multi-sectoral approach that actually ensures that operationalization of some of these policies works effectively.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to the question for Jane. Jane, could you say more about the progress on developing the UN Statement on Victims' Rights?
Thank you, and I just wanted us to remember, and picking up from Awino, this is 10 years since the adoption of the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women, which of course has been withdrawn from by the president of the country that was, which Istanbul is in. Things are very tenuous. I mean, we do have, there's so much in terms of rollback, and I think we can say this. It's not that I'd say this about the Victims' Rights Statement. I put that aside for a bit because I was given another task, and that was to develop a system-wide a set of principles relating to a victim's rights, survivor's rights approach to sexual harassment. These things run on different paths in our organizations. Sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse are, of course, underpinned by inequality, power imbalance, naked use of power, essentially. But the response is different. But developing that, and I'm almost at the end of that. With regard to the statement on victims' rights, we're pretty much there. The trick is that I've got to get those 35 members of the UN to agree with ideas you put in place. And what I wanted to do is to have an elaboration of what the meaning of victims' rights, victims of sexual exploitation and abuse, what their rights are, and what our personnel should know about their rights. So they wouldn't always say to me, "You're the victim's assistance advocate." I'm very happy to talk about the victim's rights to assistance, but the charitable approach is a bit of a slippery slope in this regard. So I think we should see it. I will get back to it very soon. We should see it in about 3 months' time, and it has taken inspiration from many documents, including the Murad Code and so on. But it is very directed to the victims of our organisations, our implementing partners, and so on, and extremely directed to making United Nations personnel, whoever they are, understand that there is a victim. They still worry about the discipline part more sometimes. There is a victim. The victim has rights, and this is what you must do to realise that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. There's one more question, I think, before we wrap up, from Dove Presnell. How can a system of accountability for SEA overcome justifiable mistrust of international actors? I think he means mistrust by international actors.
Well,
it says, how can a system of accountability for SEA overcome justifiable mistrust of international actors?
Well, I will just throw in that the experience, in terms of what I've seen, a sea change, more or less, where it is made clear to victims that you are going to pay attention to them and that you really will champion their rights, does reinstate trust to a certain extent. And this happened with, I produced a very small project to ensure so that the children of the women who had been left with those children in Haiti could go to school, and also would have one meal a day. People always laugh at this. Lunch was inside it. That made such a difference in terms of removing the mistrust of international actors in that context. And that's a form of accountability. And I think often when we think about accountability, we classify it as criminal accountability, civil accountability. Accountability is a big word and has many meanings. So I would say people on the ground who are there, who are people who can engender trust, they will encourage reporting, they will encourage things to change, they will encourage communities to trust them. But this is not very easy, of course, because this is an area where there isn't much money. Again, I mean, if you go back to resourcing, you are not finding a huge amount of money provided to those who work with victims of sexual exploitation and/or abuse on the ground. I'm a very good example. I'm this global, fabulous victims' rights advocate. I have 3 staff and no activities money. So that indicates something, but often isn't that the case with issues which pertain to women and children in particular. You stick it together with sticky tape to a certain extent.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for answering for all the questions. Unfortunately,
Nina, may I just come in very quickly?
Sure.
Dove, let me say that I would argue that those who say this is another attempt to make our women bad are likely not the women speaking. So in response to the question of accountability and the trust question, I think you must center the women, center the people who are critical to the question, have their voices, let them be part of the process of developing accountability measures. Center the victims, center the survivors.
Thank you, Awino. Okay, so we're going to finish here. Thank you so much to the panelists. I meant to say at the beginning that we had two dialing in from New York. So thank you very, very much to all three of you. Unfortunately, Peter, I think, locked himself out. But I hope you all found that all very informative. I certainly did. So please, everyone, take a break, and then we come back at 4:30 for the final roundtable of the session of the day to wrap up the whole day. So, so thank you very much, and we'll see you at 4:30. Bye.
Ciao.